Good morning. It's good to see a number of visitors with us. We're very glad that you have found your way to be with us on this Lord's Day, and we're grateful for your presence. We invite any and all questions you may have. Please stick around a little bit afterwards and let us get to know you a little bit, and love to give you the chance to ask us any questions of the Bible that you might have. This morning we're going to talk about something that I think is common to all of us. Everybody makes plans. Sometimes we make plans for the short term. I imagine everybody here has already given some thought to where lunch will be in just an hour or two. We make plans for the short term, but I'm going to talk about more of the long-term plans. How do you envision your life? What's your big plan for life? Everybody makes a plan. Now, some do it better than others. I like what Proverbs 20 and verse 5 says. The purpose, or depending on your translation, the plans in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. It's like a deep well that sometimes you have to dig really deep, that some are better at making plans than others. It takes a wise man, a man of understanding, to draw out those plans that are deep within the heart. But everybody makes a plan. But my question is, what do you do when your plans are changed for you? What do you do, as the expression goes, when life happens? Because it happens to everybody. We all make plans, yet all of us have our plans ruined from time to time. All of us have our life make a major deviation from the direction we intended that it should go. I had someone share with me the other day that life is really all about how you handle plan B. That's really the nature of life. We think it should go one way, but it inevitably will be pulled in a different direction. Time and chance, or circumstance, some people call it fate, but it happens to everybody. We cannot see the future. We cannot know what will happen even 5 minutes from now. Sometimes we have a good idea about what might come, but we just don't know. Life happens to everybody, and plans are changed even for the best planners in the world. Those who are good at making plans. So I want to spend some time this morning just talking about how we deal with the plans we make and what happens when those plans are changed for us. So I want to ask you, what is your big plan for your life? Again, there's short-term plans and there's long-term plans, and I'm talking about the long-term. What are your big plans in life? I'm going to share with you a few generic ideas, a few things that are kind of, they're my ideas, my plans. And I think many of you probably share a lot of this in common. I'm going to talk in very generic terms right now, but I suspect that your big plan, that your life's plan, it depends on where you are, how far along you are in life or how far along you are in your plan, whether you're nearing the end of the road or you've got the whole life ahead of you, so to speak. But I think your plan probably looks something like this, some variety of this, that you gave some thought to. Well, what do I want to do after high school? For some people, it involves, an imagination of your fitness level, your health, athletics. We envision that when I get older, I'm going to age very well. I'd like to still be fit as I am in high school, as when I'm 30 or 40 or 50, or I'd like to maintain a good degree of health for my age, or maybe my ambitions involve playing sports at a higher level like college or professional or Olympics. And so we think about physically or health-wise what our plans are, and I think most of us, we don't plan on sickness. I think our ideal plan involves fitness and health, vitality. Maybe when we're thinking about college, we think about, here's my dream job, and we have to do a little planning, a little thought about it. If I want this job, if I want to make this kind of money, I need to spend some time in college. And I want to go to the right school, not a little community college, not a technical school, but I want to go to, a big school. big university that everybody knows, that has a good reputation, that has a good history and good tradition, with a good football program or something. We think about the big school we want to go to so that when we're done with that, we get the big job. The job we always wanted, and of course that job pays pretty good money in our imaginations and in our plans. That's how it went in our head at one point. Well, and at some point we start thinking about, I want to settle down with Mr. or Mrs. Right. Of course, I don't want them to be too hard on the eyes, and we think about who we want to marry, what our ideal is, and what kind of person they are, and then we start thinking about kids, and I want, the 2 1/4, kids, the average American, whatever dream is now, and a yellow lab, and, beautiful children. Great, perfect little kids, and nothing at all like I was when I was little, and we just start thinking about how our family should go, who we're going to marry, how our kids are going to be, how many kids we want, and then, of course, other ambitions in life. Where am I going to live? I want to live in the big city, or I want to live out in the country, or I want to live somewhere exotic and neat. I want to travel the world, and when I'm not traveling, I want a nice house. Anybody ever thought about what your dream house is? And so I think we all do this, and like I said, that's a very generic, but I imagine most everybody here shares some, if not all of that, at some point in your life. At some point in your life, you thought about, that's how I would like things to go. That's where I'd like to be when I'm 30, when I'm 40, when I'm 50, when I hit retirement. I want to retire by the time I'm 55 or 60 or whatever. We start making ambitious plans like that, yet that's not how it always goes. But I want to talk about this. It's not an evil thing to make plans. Go to Proverbs chapter 15. We're going to spend a lot of time in the Proverbs this morning. Proverbs chapter 15. And there is room to have thoughtful plans. There is room to have concern for how your future will end up. Because the Psalms make it quite clear, as we need a smart budget. We need to use our money wisely. The fool wastes his money and doesn't plan for the future. So yes, we need to have reasonable concern for future events. We need insurance, life insurance, health insurance. We need to start investing early, and the younger the better for retirement. We need to be thoughtful about those things. And we need to be thinking, if you do want to be a doctor, you probably better go to a legitimate college. If the job you want involves an education, then you need to do some planning and thinking, how can I afford to go to school, and how can I do it and accomplish my goals? So we do need to make some plans, and most often that success is oftentimes related to thoughtful planning. Proverbs chapter 15, I want you to notice verse 22 first of all. Proverbs 15, verse 22. Without consultation, plans are frustrated, but with many counselors, they succeed. It's good to seek the advice of those older than you. It's good to ask for, your parents, your grandparents, an often underutilized resource. Ask them about what did you do for college? Do you have any regrets? Would you have done things different? Ask them about how things went because they've experienced it. It's good to get advice. It's good to talk to professionals, guidance counselors at schools and stuff like that. It's good to get lots of advice and lots of input, weigh it carefully, and make a plan, because it says without consultation, plans fail or are frustrated. Now in Proverbs 21 and verse 5, Proverbs 21 and verse 5, the plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. Now, when you read the book of Proverbs, you need to understand these are general truths, but they are not always true. They are not across the board true. Time and chance happens to everybody, but this is saying, in general terms, somebody who thoughtfully makes plans usually ends up more successful than somebody who acts hasty or rash without thinking. And so in general terms, success is often the result of good planning. So I'm not trying to say this morning, my point is not to say that making plans is evil, that it's foolish, that it's something you shouldn't be doing. We should be making plans, but we also need to be aware of the reality that plans have a way of changing on us. And so that big plan that we talked about, the path, your life path that you have planned out in advance, it might be a good plan, and you might have put some thought into it, but you need to understand, somewhere along the road there's going to be a deviation. You're going to get thrown a curveball. You're going to trip over something you didn't see coming. There's going to be changes to your plans. And we know this. If you're still in Proverbs, let's look at Proverbs 16 and verse 9, and then we'll go to the scripture in James. So Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9, the mind of a man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. We might be really good planners. We might be very thoughtful people. We might be the kind of person that can draw the water from the deep well and bring to fruition our heart's deepest plans and purposes. We might be careful planners, but it says here, again, that the Lord directs our steps. There are just some things in life that will be out of your grasp to control. And we need to accept that reality. In James chapter 4, and I like the general message here in this text in James chapter 4. It's basically saying that to plan your life is presumptuous, and it's tantamount to arrogance. To think you can plan every step of your life, or you can plan exactly what you're going to do tomorrow and assume that that is exactly how it will go. That is essentially arrogance. It says in James chapter 4 and verse 13, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we shall go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." We ought to say, if the Lord wills, we ought to acknowledge in our plans that there are things out of our control, that change is inevitable. And so we need to be able to adapt our plans. And we think about that big plan, and I'll use myself as an example. Plans have a way of adapting. At 5 years old, my big plan was to play basketball at UCLA and then live in a junkyard and invent stuff for the rest of my life. That was my plan at 5 years old. As a teenager, my plan involved going to the University of Oregon because I wanted to be a musician. I struggled with things like mathematics, reading and writing, but music, well, that came pretty easily to me and I enjoyed it. Yet, other plans got involved too. I met a girl in high school who was going to Florida for school. And not a school that is particularly well known for its band program. And so I had a dilemma. Do I follow my dreams and go to University of Oregon for music, or do I follow the pretty girl to Florida? And, well, you guys know, 11 years later, Jessica and I are still together, and I made the right choice. In fact, that's about the only thing on my plan that actually worked the right way, is I always said I'm going to get married young, and I did meet Mrs. Wright young, a little younger than I thought, but, life has a way of changing your plans. I come to realize I didn't want to be a musician, and college was just not a good fit for me. So I've been working on preaching since high school, and the more I did it, the more I thought I'd enjoy doing this and thought I would be useful to God serving in this capacity. And so I decided that I made a decision to leave college and pursue preaching on my own terms. And so, again, you have these big plans, and I hope this is not an insult to anybody. It's not intended as an insult to anybody here, but I'll be honest and say 10, 15 years ago, Utah was not on my list of places I wanted to be. It didn't even enter into my mind that, hey, that's an exotic, cool, fun place to live. Now, I've loved being here. But you see how that goes? You plan one thing in your mind, and then life happens and it changes. And the Apostle Paul is somebody who understood this concept very well. Paul oftentimes made plans that were frustrated, that were interrupted, where he had to scrap his plans altogether. If we go to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul talks about what he intends to do. Now, Paul is certainly taking James's advice to say, if the Lord wills. Paul intended. He's talking about his intentional plans. In 1 Corinthians 16, we're going to start in verse 5. Paul understands that there is room for time and chance, for circumstance. So he's only talking about what he wants to do, what he intends to do. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 5. But I shall come to you after I go through Macedonia, for I am going through Macedonia, and perhaps I shall stay with you, or even spend the winter, that you may send me on my way wherever I may go. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time, if the Lord permits. If you read on in verse 8, you understand that I shall remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. Paul was in Ephesus when he wrote this letter, and if you look in Acts chapter 19, you see some events that unfolded in Paul's life that kept him from being able to keep his intentional plans. In Acts chapter 19, while in Ephesus, a riot occurs, a great riot, and they start, almost destroying the city, demanding to, have Paul executed, and so he runs away for his life, and then kind of a series of events where every place that Paul goes to, he's pursued by people that want to kill him. And so he's unable to carry out his plans. He's unable to go to Corinth like he intended to because he encountered some unforeseen troubles. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul writes about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He says, hey, sorry I never made it, but I was prevented. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, we're going to notice in verse 15 now. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 15. And in this confidence I intended at first to come to you, that you might twice receive a blessing. That is, to pass your way into Macedonia, and again from Macedonia to come to you, and by you to be helped on my journey to Judea. And again, Paul is saying, this is what I intended to do, to spend some lengthy period of time with you, see you twice, and even get some help from you to go on further journeys. Therefore, I was not vacillating when I intended to do this, was I? Or that which I purpose, do I purpose according to the flesh? That with me there should be yes, yes and no, no at the same time? And so Paul had a lot of enemies at Corinth. We're studying this on Wednesday nights, and I think that's pretty apparent, that there were those who opposed Paul. There were those who didn't agree with his teachings, or who, probably liked Cephas, the apostle, better, or who liked Apollos better, and so they didn't really care for Paul. And so Paul has to defend himself from time to time in the Corinthian letters. And here he's defending himself. He says, I wasn't lying, I wasn't vacillating. I really did genuinely intend to come and visit you. But life happened. I had to run for my life. And so my itinerary was changed for me. Now, another occasion in Paul's life involved the church in Rome. Another occasion where Paul had to change up his plans. Go to Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, we read about another intended itinerary for a journey of Paul. This is what Paul wanted to do. Romans chapter 15 and verse 23. But now, with no further place for me in these regions, and since I have had for many years a longing to come to you, whenever I go to Spain, for I hope, again, there's that idea, he understands, I can't guarantee anything, I hope to see you in passing and to be helped on my way there by you, when I have first enjoyed your company for a while. But now, I'm going to Jerusalem serving the saints. He was taking that collection that he'd been taking up through all the churches there in Macedonia and along the way. You read about that in Corinth and in other places where Paul had been collecting for the needy saints in Jerusalem. And now Paul says, I've got to go there first. But when I'm done with that, my plan is to visit you on my way to Spain. When you read Acts, when you go to the book of Acts, again, you understand that the events that soon unfolded in Paul's life were far different from the itinerary which he intended. In Acts chapter 21, he's given a warning. Acts chapter 21, in verse 10. It says in Acts 21, verse 10, that As we were staying there for some days, a certain prophet named Agabus came down from Judea, and coming to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own feet and hands and said, "This is what the Holy Spirit says. In this way, the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." Paul is given a warning that when he arrives in Jerusalem, this is what will happen. He'll become a prisoner. And he'll be delivered over to the Gentiles. Paul says, I know, but I need to finish this task I started. I need to take this to Jerusalem. And at the end of chapter 21, when he goes into the temple, some people assume that he had been taking Gentiles into the temple, and they cast hands upon him and bring him before the Jewish high council. And so in Acts chapter 22, he's before the Jewish high council and gives his defense. In Acts chapter 23, I want you to notice verse 12, Acts 23 and verse 12. He gives another defense, Acts 23 and verse 12. "And when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul." So the Roman authorities intervene. They take Paul as a prisoner, and they find out he's a Roman citizen. So now the Roman guards are obligated to protect Paul, yet the Jewish high council wants him put to death. And now a plot is formed to kill him. That some men said, we're not even going to rest. We're not even going to eat food until Paul is dead. And this kind of throws a wrench in his plans. If you're still in Acts 23, look at verse 23. This information becomes known to a nephew of Paul's. They bring it to the lead Roman guard or soldier, and he says, he calls 2 centurions and says, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." They're going to take Paul out, heavily guarded, and take him to Caesarea so that he can get what they believe will be a fair trial. And again, as these events unfold, in Acts chapter 24, he goes before Felix and doesn't really find any help. Acts chapter 24 and verse 27, it says, "But after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison." So 2 years. This is a 2-year detour. Paul wanted to be in Spain by now, I imagine. But now he's been sitting in Caesarea for 2 years. Because Felix is unwilling to let him go, even though he knows he probably should. But wanting to play politics and do the Jews a favor, he leaves him in prison. In Acts chapter 25, he goes before Agrippa and Festus, and again finds no justice, and he makes his appeal to Caesar. And I want to tell you what happens. Paul wanted to go to Rome, and he gets there. In Acts chapter 28 and verse 30, and a lot of things happen in between, including a shipwreck where he was lost at sea and stranded on an island for a period of time. In Acts chapter 28 and verse 30, he finally does get to Rome. But this is not on the time frame he wanted and not in the way he intended. And he stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters and was welcoming all who came to him. So there's another 2 years. You add maybe another year of time with all the travel and being lost at sea and stranded on the island of Patmos, or not the island of Patmos, but you add another time where he's stranded on the island, and that's maybe 5 years. Paul wanted to go to Rome and then to Spain, but now he's sitting for 4 to 5 years in a prison waiting for justice, waiting for his case to be heard by Caesar. But you know what? He did arrive in Rome. The Bible never tells us if he made it to Spain. The tradition about Paul says he did make it to Spain eventually. I don't know if that's true or not, but he said, I want to come to Rome, and he got there. But do you see what happened to Paul? His plans were changed. And so the question I want to spend the remaining time with you is, how did Paul cope with this? Because we see on a number of occasions, Paul, even though he was an apostle, even though he was a man inspired by the Holy Spirit to reveal the commandments of the Lord, Paul didn't always know what awaited him around the next corner. Paul didn't know what would happen the next day. And so he was stuck in the same place that you and I are. We do our best to make plans. We do our best to think, if I want to accomplish this work for God, Paul says, I want to go somewhere where the gospel's never been preached, and that's Spain. So Paul is giving some thought to his plans, yet his plans are changed. Same thing that happens to us. How did Paul cope with the change? Because maybe this is the position you find yourself in. Maybe you think about your plans for life. Maybe you had a dream job, but college wasn't in the cards for you. Maybe you think about the kids you wanted, and maybe health issues become involved, and you've got a child that has health issues that are not something you anticipated. Maybe you think about your own health, and it's a diagnosis that changes the outlook of your life. Things like this happen all the time. How do we cope with those changes? Maybe I'm not the person I thought I would be by this point in my life. What happened to change that? Maybe I'm making plans for the future, but something's happened and now I don't know how certain that is. Maybe I'm still waiting for Mr. or Mrs. Right. I mean, we think about this. How do we cope with those changes? What we plan our life to be isn't always, in fact, probably never is, how it actually turns out. How do we cope with those changes? And I want to share with you a couple of thoughts from the life of Paul. We know that Paul had his plans changed for him. How did he cope with that? First thing that Paul did to handle the changes in his life was that he didn't lose sight of what the main goal was. For Paul, his goal was to bring glory to God and preach the gospel. Philippians chapter 1. We're going to look at a couple of scriptures now from Philippians. I think Philippians, it was written while Paul was sitting in a prison cell. And so I think this gives a lot of clarity into, Paul's thought process when he's right in the middle of his plans for life being changed. It would be easy for someone in Paul's position, having spent 4 to 5 years, we might call that hard time in prison. Now, maybe it wasn't the worst of conditions always, but Paul had been in prison for a while. He's probably wondering, what good can come of this? Yet in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, we see Paul's attitude. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul said, my main goal is to glorify God and to live a Christ-filled life, and I can do that regardless of the circumstances. He didn't lose sight of the main goal in life. And so for us, the first things always have to go first. Let's go back to Proverbs really quick. Proverbs 16. And I want to make an appeal to those in the audience this morning, those listening. If you are old enough to listen, yet young enough that most of your life still seems ahead of you, I want you to think carefully about what your first and primary goal in life is. Is it God? Is it glorifying God? Because if you make God your primary goal in life, if you make His glory your number one goal, you'll accomplish that. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 3, commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. God never guarantees that when you plan something for you, it will happen. But God says if you commit your plans to me, if you make me your number one ambition, if you seek first the kingdom of Christ, God says, I'll make that happen. If serving God, if pleasing God and glorifying His name is the number one goal in your life, then you're not going to worry about the bumps in the road as much. You're not going to be consumed by things that could have been but didn't happen. God says, if you commit your ways and your plans to me, I'll establish them. I will make the straight path that leads right to heaven. Secondly, and here's an interesting phrase, Paul was looking for the collateral blessings. Now, we talk about collateral damage, where like in warfare, if you bomb a target and you try to take out the enemies, but you get 2 or 3 civilians, you'd call that collateral damage, unintended consequences, unintended damage. Now, in terms of blessings, sometimes there's unintended blessings as well. We have to have our eyes open to see these, though. If you go back to Philippians chapter 1, and this only works if your number one goal is serving God, is pleasing God and glorifying Him. Paul said, I'm ready to die for Christ. You know, in Acts chapter 21, when Agabus said, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound, and you're going to be put in prison, and you're going to be delivered over to the Gentiles, and everybody told Paul, don't go, and he says, don't try to stop me. I'm ready to lay down my life for Christ, because that is the number one goal in my life, is to do what God wants me to do, and to obey Him, and faithfully carry out the work that's been committed to me to do. Paul was willing to lay down his life. So his priorities were in line. First thing came first with Paul. He was seeking first the glory of God. And so secondly, because that was his first goal, Paul was able to recognize collateral blessings. Philippians chapter 1. Sorry, I got a bit sidetracked there. Philippians chapter 1, if we start in verse 12, again, Paul wanted to see that the gospel was preached. I doubt this is what Paul had in mind, but he says, I can't argue with the results. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 12. Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else, and that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ, even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. Paul was able to recognize that the gospel is being preached. He was willing to lay down his life for Christ, and that's why he was sitting in prison, not being able to do things the way he wanted to do them, but his eyes were open for the collateral blessings. You might not be exactly at the point you wanted to be in life. A curveball might have come your way. But if you trust in God, if you put Him first, keep your eyes open and understand that no matter where you are in life, no matter what your circumstances are, there are good things. There are blessings. We might not see it. I doubt Paul could immediately see the blessings of being stuck in a prison cell, but Paul had his eyes open and he eventually recognized them. Good has come from my circumstances. If our eyes are open, if we have the right attitude, and if our first priority is serving and glorifying God, we'll find a way to make any circumstance in life a good thing. And thirdly, Paul trusted in God. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6. You all know this verse. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. One of the best sermons I ever heard was you worry about nothing and pray about everything. Everything that's in the worry or anxiety column, you move it over to the prayer column. Whatever it is in your life that has altered or shifted your plans, that has changed the trajectory of where you intended your life to go, pray about it and trust in God. Trust in God. We need to have this confidence and faith that God is working on our behalf, even when we don't perceive it. Romans chapter 8, I'm going to finish with two scriptures. Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. You guys know this one. I think it's somewhat misused or misapplied scripture, but Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Now, this doesn't mean that God's going to make your life perfect and easy and problem-free. But God is saying, no matter what happens to you, I am greater than all the ups and downs in life. I am greater than all the bad circumstances, and no matter what happens to you, if you trust in me, if you follow me where I lead you, it will result in good. Doesn't necessarily mean in this life, But if we follow God, if we put our trust in him, he will make the path to heaven, to be with him forever. He will make that path clear to us when we trust in him. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 5 is where I'd like to leave you this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 5. We don't always recognize when God is at work. When something bad happens to us, at first that is all that it seems to be, something bad. We don't always see what God is doing. We don't always perceive what God is doing. But that's where we need faith and trust in him. That if we put God first in our lives, and we don't lose sight of the main goal, that is to glorify God with our lives, and to be willing to lay down our lives in serving him, and if we have our eyes open, we'll see that God can do wonderful things through us no matter what our circumstances are in life. We look for the collateral blessings, and we continue to trust in God, even if we don't always see it at the moment. Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 5, just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. We don't always see what God is doing. We don't always understand what God is doing, but he has promised us, if you follow my voice, if you follow where I lead you, it will be good. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Like I said, I think making plans is something we all share in common, and certainly having our plans change is something that we all share in common. How we deal with those changes, that's what life is. It's how we handle Plan B. That's life. And I think Paul had a good way to deal with this. Keep your focus on God, seek him first, have your eyes open for blessings, and look for ways to turn whatever negative circumstances into something good for others and for God, and keep trusting in him. Keep praying. It will work out for your good if you trust in God. Now I'll invite you at this time as we prepare to sing the invitation song. If you are ready this morning to commit your life to Christ, if you need prayers, need encouragement from your brethren, we invite you to come forward and make that known as we stand and sing.